Good evening to anybody who's watching, and I think at the moment that's nobody, but never mind. Um, so this is essentially a book at bedtime if you are in the UK and you're heading to bed at about 11 p.m. or alternatively, I guess it's around tea time-ish in the United States or a little later in Europe. Anyway, tonight I shall be reading chapter 1 from Virginia Woolf's Orlando, a book which I haven't read for several years, but one of my favourite of Woolf's work. So, let me begin reading chapter 1. He, for there could be no doubt of his sex, though the fashion of the time did something to disguise it, was in the act of slicing at the head of a maw which swung from the rafters. It was the colour of an old football, and more or less the shape of one, save for the sunken cheeks and a strand or two of coarse, dry hair, like the hair on a coconut. Orlando's father, or perhaps his grandfather, had struck it from the shoulders of a vast pagan who had started up under the moon in the barbarian fields of Africa, and now it swung gently, perpetually, in the breeze which never ceased blowing through the attic rooms of the gigantic house of the lord who had slain him. Orlando's fathers had ridden in fields of asphodel, and stony fields, and fields watered by strange rivers, and they had struck many heads off many colours, off many shoulders, and brought them back to hang from the rafters. So too would Orlando, he vowed. But since he was 16 only, and too young to ride with them in Africa or France, he would steal away from his mother and the peacocks in the garden, and go to his attic room, and there lunge and plunge and slice the air with his blade. Sometimes he cut the cord so that the skull bumped on the floor, and he had to string it up again, fastening it with some chivalry, almost out of reach, so that his enemy grinned at him through shrunk black lips triumphantly. The skull swung to and fro, for the house, at the top of which he lived, was so vast that there seemed trapped in it the wind itself, blowing this way, blowing that way, winter and summer. The green arras with the hunters on it moved perpetually. His fathers had been noble since they had been at all. They came out of the northern mists wearing coronets on their heads, were not the bars of darkness in the room, and the yellow pools which checkered the floor, made by the sun falling through the stained glass of a vast coat of arms in the wall. He skirted all stables, kennels, breweries, carpenters' shops, wash-houses, places where they make tallow candles, kill oxen, forge horseshoes, stitch jerkins, for the house was a town, ringing with men at work at their various crafts, and gained the ferny path leading uphill through the park unseen. There is perhaps a kinship among qualities. One draws another along with it, and the biographer should here call attention to the fact that this clumsiness is often mated with a love of solitude. Having stumbled over a chest, Orlando naturally loved solitary places, vast views, and to feel himself forever and ever alone. So, after a long silence, "I am alone," he breathed at last, opening his lips for the first time in this record. He had walked very quickly uphill through ferns and hawthorn bushes, startling deer and wild birds, to a place crowned by a single oak tree. It was very high, so high indeed that 19 English counties could be seen beneath, and on clear days 30 or perhaps 40 if the weather was very fine. Sometimes one could see the English Channel, wave reiterating upon wave. Rivers could be seen, and pleasure boats gliding on them, and galleons setting out to sea, and armadas with puffs of smoke from which came the dull thud of cannon firing, and forts on the coast, and castles among the meadows, and here a watch-tower, and there a fortress, and again some vast mansion like that of Orlando's father, massed like a town in the valley circled by walls. To the east there were the spires of London and the smoke of the city, and perhaps on the very skyline, when the wind was in the right quarter, the craggy top and serrated edges of Snowdon herself showed mountainous among the clouds. For a moment Orlando stood counting, gazing, recognizing. That was his father's house, that was his uncle's. His aunt owned these 3 great turrets among the trees there. The heath was theirs and the forest, the pheasant and the deer, the fox, the badger and the butterfly. He sighed profoundly, and flung himself, there was a passion in his movements which deserves the word, on the earth at the front of the oak tree. He loved, beneath all this summer transiency, to feel the earth's spine beneath him. For such he took the hard root of the oak tree to be. Or, for image followed image, it was the back of a great horse that he was riding, or the deck of a tumbling ship. It was anything indeed, so long as it was hard, for he felt the need of something which he could attach his floating heart to. The heart that tugged at his side, the heart that seemed filled with spiced and amorous gales every evening about this time when he walked about. To the oak tree he tied it, and as he lay there, gradually the flutter in and about him stilled itself. The little leaves hung, the deer stopped, the pale summer clouds stayed. His limbs grew heavy on the ground, and he lay so still that by degrees the deer stepped nearer, and the rooks wheeled round him, and the swallows dipped and circled, and the dragonflies shot past, as if all the fertility and amorous activity of a summer's evening were woven web-like about his body. After an hour or so, the sun was rapidly sinking, the white clouds had turned red. The hills were violet, the woods purple, the valleys black. A trumpet sounded. Orlando leapt to his feet. The shrill sound came from the valley. It came from a dark spot down there, a spot compact and mapped out, a maze, a town, yet girt about with walls. It came from the heart of his own great house in the valley, which, dark before, even as he looked, and the single trumpet duplicated and reduplicated itself with other shriller sounds, lost its darkness and became pierced with lights. Some were small hurrying lights, as if servants dashed along corridors to answer summonses. Others were high and lustrous lights, as if they burnt in empty banqueting halls made ready to receive guests who had not come. And others dipped and waved and sank and rose, as if held in the hands of troops of serving men, bending, kneeling, rising, receiving, guarding, and escorting, with all dignity indoors, a great princess alighting from her chariot. Coaches turned and wheeled in the courtyard. Horses tossed their plumes. The Queen had come. Orlando looked no more. He dashed downhill. He let himself in at a wicket gate. He tore up the winding staircase. He reached his room. He tossed his stockings to one side of the room, his jerkin to the other. He dipped his head. He scoured his hands. He pared his fingernails, with no more than 6 inches of looking-glass and a pair of old candles to help him. He had thrust on crimson breeches, lace collar, waistcoat of taffeta, and shoes with rosettes on them as big as double dahlias in less than 10 minutes by the stable clock. He was ready. He was flushed. He was excited, but he was terribly late. By shortcuts known to him, he made his way now through the vast congeries of rooms and staircases to the banqueting hall, 5 acres distant on the other side of the house. But halfway there, in the back quarters where the servants lived, he stopped. The door of Mrs. Stukely's sitting room stood open. She was gone, doubtless with all her keys to wait upon her mistress. But there, sitting at the servants' dinner table with a tankard beside him and paper in front of him, sat a rather fat, rather shabby man whose ruff was a thought dirty, and whose clothes were of hodden brown. He held a pen in his hand, but he was not writing. He seemed in the act of rolling some thought up and down, to and fro in his mind, till it gathered shape or momentum to his liking. His eyes, globed and clouded like some green stone of curious texture, were fixed. He did not see Orlando. For all his hurry, Orlando stopped dead. Was this a poet? Was he writing poetry? Tell me, he wanted to say, everything in the whole world, for he had the wildest, most absurd, extravagant ideas about poets and poetry. But how speak to a man who does not see you, who sees ogres, satyrs, perhaps the depth of the sea itself instead? So Orlando stood gazing while the man turned his pen in his fingers, this way and that way, and gazed and mused, and then very quickly wrote 6 lines and looked up. Whereupon Orlando, overcome with shyness, darted off and reached the banqueting hall only just in time to sink upon his knees and, hanging his head in confusion, to offer a bowl of rose water to the great Queen herself. Such was his shyness that he saw no more of her than her ringed hand in water. But it was enough. It was a memorable hand, a thin hand with long fingers always curling as if round orb or sceptre. A nervous, crabbed, sickly hand. A commanding hand, too. A hand that had only to raise itself for a head to fall. A hand, he guessed, attached to an old body that smelt like a cupboard in which furs are kept in camphor. Which body was yet caparisoned in all sorts of brocades and gems, and held itself very upright, though perhaps in pain from sciatica, and never flinched, though strung together by 1,000 fears, and the Queen's eyes were light yellow. All this he felt as the great rings flashed in the water, and then something pressed his hair, which perhaps accounts for his seeing nothing more idly to be of use to a historian. And in truth his mind was such a welter of opposites, of the night and the blazing candles, of the shabby poet and the great Queen, of silent fields and the clatter of serving men, that he could see nothing, or only a hand. By the same showing, the Queen herself can have seen only a head. But it is possible from a hand to deduce a body, informed with all the attributes of a great Queen, her crabbedness, courage, frailty, and terror. Surely a head can be as fertile, looked down upon from a chair of state by a lady whose eyes were always, if the waxworks at the Abbey are to be trusted, wide open. The long curled hair, the dark head, bent so reverently, so innocently before her, implied a pair of the finest legs that a young nobleman has ever stood upright upon, and violet eyes, and a heart of gold, and loyalty and manly charm, all qualities which the old woman loved the more they failed her. For she was growing old and worn and bent before her time. The sound of cannon was always in her ears. She saw always the glistening poison drop and the long stiletto. As she sat at table she listened. She heard the guns in the Channel. She dreaded. Was that a curse? Was that a whisper? Innocence, simplicity, were all the more dear to her for the dark background she set them against. And it was that same night, so tradition has it, when Orlando was sound asleep, that she made over formally, putting her hand and seal finally to the parchment, the gift of the great monastic house that had been the Archbishop's and then the King's, to Orlando's father. Orlando slept all night in ignorance. He had been kissed by a queen without knowing it. And perhaps, for women's hearts are intricate, it was his ignorance and the start he gave when her lips touched him that the memory of her young cousin, for they had blood in common, green in her mind. At any rate, 2 years of this quiet country life had not passed, and Orlando had written no more perhaps than 20 tragedies and a dozen histories and a score of sonnets, when a message came that he was to attend the Queen at Whitehall. "Here," she said, watching him advance down the long gallery towards her, "comes my innocent." There was a serenity about him always which had the look of innocence when, technically, the world was no longer applicable. "Come," she said. She was sitting bolt upright by the fire, and she held him a foot's pace from her, and looked him up and down. Was she matching her speculations the other night with the truth now visible? Did she find her guesses justified? Eyes, mouth, nose, breast, hips, hands, she ran them over. Her lips twitched visibly as she looked. But when she saw his legs, she laughed out loud. He was the very image of a noble gentleman, but inwardly she flashed her yellow hawk's eyes upon him as if she would pierce his soul. The man withstood her gaze, blushing only a damask rose as became him. Strength, grace, romance, folly, poetry, youth. She read him like a page. Instantly she plucked a ring from her finger. The joint was swollen, rather. And as she fitted it to his, named him her treasurer and steward, next hung about him chains of office, and bidding him bend his knee, tied round it at the slenderest part the jewelled order of the Garter. Nothing after that was denied him. When she drove in state, he rode at her carriage door. She sent him to Scotland on a sad embassy to the unhappy Queen. She was about to sail for the Polish wars, when she recalled him. For how could she bear to think of that tender flesh torn and that curly head rolled in the lust? She kept him with her at the height of her triumph, when the guns were booming at the tower, and the air was thick enough with gunpowder to make one sneeze, and the huzzas of the people rang beneath the windows. She pulled him down among the cushions where her woman had laid her. She was so worn and old, and made him bury his face in that astonishing composition. She had not changed her dress for a month, which not for all the world, he thought, recalling his boyish memory, like some old cabinet at home where his mother's furs were stored. He rose half suffocated from the embrace. "This," she breathed, "is my victory," even as a rocket roared up and dyed her cheeks scarlet. For the old woman loved him, and the Queen, who knew a man when she saw one, though not, it is said, in the usual way, plotted for him a splendid ambitious career. Lands were given him, houses assigned him. He was to be the sun of her old age, the limb of her infirmity, the oak tree on which she leant her degradation. She croaked out these promises in strange domineering tendernesses. They were at Richmond now, sitting bolt upright in her stiff brocades by the fire, which, however high they piled it, never kept her warm. Meanwhile the long winter months drew on. Every tree in the park was lined with frost. The river ran sluggishly. One day, when the snow was on the ground and the dark panelled rooms were full of shadows and the stags were barking in the park, she saw in the mirror, which she kept for fear of spies always by her, through the door which she kept for fear of murderers always open, a boy, could it be Orlando, kissing a girl? Who in the devil's name was the brazen hussy? Snatching at her golden hilted sword, she struck violently at the mirror. The glass crashed. People came running. She was lifted and set in her chair again. But she was stricken after that, and groaned much as her days wore to an end of Matten's treachery. It was Orlando's fault, perhaps. Yet, after all, are we to blame Orlando? The age was the Elizabethan. Their morals were not ours, nor their poets, nor their climate, nor their vegetables even. Everything was different. The weather itself, the heat and cold of summer and winter, was, we may believe, of another temper altogether. The brilliant amorous day was divided as sheerly from the night as land from water. Sunsets were redder and more intense. Dawns were whiter and more auroral. Of our crepuscular half-lights and lingering twilights they knew nothing. The rain fell vehemently, or not at all. The sun blazed or there was darkness. Translating this to the spiritual regions as their wont is, the poets sang beautifully how roses fade and petals fall. The moment is brief, they sang. The moment is over. One long night is then to be slept by all. As for using the artifices of the greenhouse or conservatory to prolong or preserve these fresh pinks and roses, that was not their way. The withered intricacies and ambiguities of our more gradual and doubtful age were unknown to them. Violence was all. The flower bloomed and faded, the sun rose and sank, the lover loved and went. And what the poets said in rhyme, the young translated into practice. Girls were roses, and their seasons were short as the flowers. Plucked they must be before nightfall, for the day was brief and the day was all. Thus, if Orlando followed the leading of the climate, of the poets, of the age itself, and plucked his flower in the window-seat, even with the snow on the ground and the Queen vigilant in the corridor, we can scarcely bring ourselves to blame him. He was young, he was boyish. He did but as nature bade him do. As for the girl, we know no more than the Queen Elizabeth herself did what her name was. It may have been Doris, Chloris, Delia, or Diana, for he made rhymes to them all in turn. Equally, she may have been a court lady or some serving maid. For Orlando's taste was broad. He was no lover of garden flowers only. The wild and the weeds even had always a fascination for him. Here, indeed, we lay bare rudely, as a biographer may, a curious trait in him, to be accounted for perhaps by the fact that a certain grandmother of his had worn a smock and carried milk pails. Some grains of the Kentish or Sussex earth were mixed with the thin, fine fluid which came to him from Normandy. He held that the mixture of brown earth and blue blood was a good one. Certain it is that he always had a liking for low company, especially for that of lettered people whose wits so often keep them under, as if there were the sympathy of blood between them. At this season of his life, when his head brimmed with rhymes, and he never went to bed without striking off some conceit, the cheek of an innkeeper's daughter seemed fresher, and the wit of a gamekeeper's niece seemed quicker than those of the ladies at court. Hence he began going frequently to Wapping Old Stairs and the beer gardens at night, wrapped in a grey cloak to hide the star at his neck and the garter at his knee. There, with a mug before him, among the sanded alleys and bowling greens, and all the simple architecture of such places, he listened to sailors' stories of hardship and horror and cruelty on the Spanish Main, how some had lost their toes, others their noses, for the spoken story was never so rounded or so finely coloured as the written. Especially he loved to hear from them volley forth their songs of the Azores, while the parakeets which they had brought from those parts pecked at the rings in their ears, tapped with their hard, acquisitive beaks at the rubies on their fingers, and swore as vilely as their masters. The women were scarcely less bold in their speech, and less free in their manners than the birds. They perched on his knee, flung their arms round his neck, and guessing that something out of the common lay hid beneath his duffel cloak, were quite as eager to come at the truth of the matter as Orlando himself. Nor was opportunity lacking. The river was astir early and late with barges, wherries, and craft of all description. Every day sailed to sea some fine ship bound for the Indies. Now and again another blackened and ragged with hairy unknown men on board crept painfully to anchor. No one missed a boy or girl if they dallied a little on the water after sunset, or raised an eyebrow if gossip had seen them sleeping soundly among the treasure sacks, safe in each other's arms. Such indeed was the adventure that befell Orlando, Suki, and the Earl of Cumberland. The day was hot, their loves had been active, they had fallen asleep among the rubies. Late that night the Earl, whose fortunes were much bound up in the Spanish ventures, came to check the booty alone with a lantern. He flashed a light on a barrel. He started back with an oath. Twined about the cask, two spirits lay sleeping. Superstitious by nature, and his conscience laden with many a crime, the Earl took the couple. They were wrapped in a red cloak, and Suki's bosom was almost as white as the eternal snows of Orlando's poetry, for a phantom sprung from the graves of drowned sailors to upbraid him. He crossed himself. He vowed repentance. The row of almshouses still standing in the Sheen Road is the visible fruit of that moment's panic. 12 poor old women of the parish today drink tea, and tonight bless his lordship for a roof above their heads, so that illicit love in a treasure ship, but we omit the moral. Soon, however, Orlando grew tired, not only of the discomfort of this way of life, and of the crabbed streets of the neighbourhood, but of the primitive manners of the people. For it has to be remembered that crime and poverty had none of the attraction for the Elizabethans that they have for us. They had none of our modern shame of book learning, and none of our belief that to be born the son of a butcher is a blessing, and to be unable to read a virtue. No fancy that what we call life and reality are somehow connected with ignorance and brutality, nor, indeed, any equivalent for these two words at all. It was not to seek life that Orlando went among them, not in quest of reality that he left them. But when he heard a score of times how many Jakes had lost his nose and Suki had her honour, and they told the stories admirably, it must be admitted, he began to be a little weary of the repetition, for a nose can only be cut off in one way and maidenhood lost in another, or so it seemed to him, whereas the arts and the sciences had a diversity about them which stirred his curiosity profoundly. So, always keeping them in happy memory, he left off frequenting the beer gardens and the skittle alleys, hung his grey cloak in his wardrobe, let his star shine at his neck and his garter twinkle at his knee, and appeared once more at the court of King James. He was young, he was rich, he was handsome. No one could have received with could have been received with greater acclamation than he was. It is certain indeed that many ladies were ready to show him their favours. The names of 3 at least were freely coupled with his in marriage: Clorinda, Favilla, Euphrosyne, so he called them in his sonnets. To take them in order, Clorinda was a sweet-mannered, gentle lady enough. Indeed, Orlando was greatly taken with her for 6 months and a half. But she had white eyelashes and could not bear the sight of blood. A hare brought up roasted at her father's table turned her fate. She was much under the influence of the priests, too, and stinted her underlinen in order to give to the poor. She took it on her to reform Orlando of his sins, which sickened him, so that he drew back from the marriage, and did not much regret it when she died soon after of the smallpox. Favilla, who comes next, was of a different sort altogether. She was the daughter of a poor Somersetshire gentleman who, by sheer assiduity and the use of her eyes, had worked her way up at court, where her address in horsemanship, her fine instep, and her grace in dancing won the admiration of all. Once, however, she was so ill advised as to whip a spaniel that had torn one of her silk stockings, and it must be said in justice that Favilla had few stockings, and those for the most part of drugget. Within an inch of its life beneath Orlando's window, Orlando, who was a passionate lover of animals, now noticed that her teeth were crooked, and the 2 front turned inward, which, she said, is a pure sign of a perverse and cruel disposition in woman, and so broke the engagement that very night forever. The third, Euphrosyne, was by far the most serious of his flames. She was by birth one of the Irish Desmonds, and had therefore a family tree of her own, as old and deeply rooted as Orlando's itself. She was fair, florid, and a trifle phlegmatic. She spoke Italian well, had a perfect set of teeth in the upper jaw, though those on the lower were slightly discoloured. She was never without a whippet or spaniel at her knee, fed them with bright bread from her own plate, sang sweetly to the virginals, and was never dressed before midday, owing to the extreme care she took of her person. In short, she would have made a perfect wife for such a nobleman as Orlando, and matters had gone so far that the lawyers on both sides were busy with covenants, jointures, settlements, messuages, tenements, and whatever is needed before one great fortunate can mate with another, when the suddenness and severity that then marked the English climate, came the great frost. The great frost was, historians tell us, the most severe that has ever visited these islands. Birds froze in mid-air and fell like stones to the ground. At Norwich, a young countrywoman started to cross the road in her usual robust health, and was seen by onlookers to turn visibly to powder and be blown in a puff of dust over the roofs as the icy blast struck her at the street corner. The mortality among sheep and cattle was enormous. Corpses froze and could not be drawn from the sheets. It was no uncommon sight to come upon a whole herd of swine frozen immovable upon the road. The fields were full of shepherds, ploughmen, teams of horses, and little birds scaring boys, all struck stark in the act of the moment, one with his hand to his nose, another with the bottle to his lips, a third with a stone raised to throw at the raven who sat, as if stuffed, upon the hedge within a yard of him. The severity of the frost was so extraordinary that a kind of petrifaction sometimes ensued, and it was commonly supposed that the great increase of rocks in some parts of Derbyshire was due to no eruption, for there was none, but to the solidification of unfortunate wayfarers who had been turned literally to stone where they stood. The church could give little help in the matter, and though some landowners had these relics blessed, the most part preferred to use them either as landmarks, scratching posts for sheep, or, when the form of the stone allowed, drinking troughs for cattle, which purposes they serve admirably for the most part to this day. But while the country people suffered the extremity of want, and the trade of the country was at a standstill, London enjoyed a carnival of the utmost brilliancy. The court was at Greenwich, and the new king seized the opportunity that his coronation gave him to curry favour with the citizens. He directed that the river, which was frozen to a depth of 20 feet and more for 6 or 7 miles on either side, should be swept, decorated, and given all the semblance of a park or pleasure ground, with arbours, mazes, alleys, drinking booths, etc., at his expense. For himself and the courtiers, he reserved a certain space immediately opposite the palace gates, which, railed off from the public only by a silken rope, became at once the centre of the most brilliant society in England. Great statesmen in their beards and ruffs dispatched affairs of state under the crimson awning of the royal pagoda. Soldiers planned the conquest of the Moor and the downfall of the Turk in striped arbours surmounted by plumes of ostrich feathers. Admirals strode up and down the narrow pathways, glass in hand, sweeping the horizon and telling stories of the North-West Passage and the Spanish Armada. Lovers dallied upon divans spread with sables. Frozen roses fell in showers when the Queen and her ladies walked abroad. Coloured balloons hovered motionless in the air. Here and there burnt vast bonfires of cedar and oak wood, lavishly salted so that the flames were of green, orange, and purple fire. But however fiercely they burnt, the heat was not enough to melt the ice, which, though of singular transparency, was yet of the hardness of steel. So clear indeed was it that there could be seen congealed at a depth of several feet, here a porpoise, there a flounder. Shoals of eels lay motionless in a trance, but whether their state was one of death or merely of suspended animation which the warmth could revive puzzled the philosophers. Near London Bridge, where the river had frozen to a depth of some 20 fathoms, a wrecked wherry-boat was plainly visible, lying on the bed of the river where it had sunk last autumn, overladen with apples. The old bumboat woman, who was carrying her fruit to market on the Surrey side, sat there in her plaids and farthingales with her lap full of apples, for all the world as if she were about to serve a customer, though a certain blueness about the lips hinted the truth. 'Twas a sight King James specially liked to look upon, and he would bring a troop of courtiers to gaze with him. In short, nothing could exceed the brilliancy and gaiety of the scene by day, but it was at night that the carnival was at its merriest. For the frost continued unbroken, the nights were of perfect stillness, the moon and stars blazed with the hard fixity of diamonds, and to the fine music of flute and trumpet the courtiers danced. Orlando, it is true, was none of those who tread lightly the Coranto and La Volta. He was clumsy and a little absent-minded. He much preferred the plain dances of his own country, which he had danced as a child, to these fantastic foreign measures. He had indeed just brought his feet together about 6 in the evening of the 7th of January at the finish of some such quadrille or minuet which he beheld, coming from the pavilion of the Muscovite embassy, a figure which, whether boy's or woman's, for the loose tunic and trousers of the Russian fashion served to disguise the sex, filled him with the highest curiosity. The person, whatever the name or sex, was about middle height, very slenderly fashioned, and dressed entirely in oyster-coloured velvet, trimmed with some unfamiliar greenish-coloured fur. But these details were obscured by the extraordinary seductiveness which issued from the whole person. Images, metaphors of the most extreme and extravagant, twined and twisted in his mind. He called her a melon, a pineapple, an olive tree, an emerald, and a fox in the snow, all in the space of 3 seconds. He did not know whether he had heard her, tasted her, seen her, or all three together. For though we must pause not a moment in the narrative, we may here hastily note that all his images at this time were simple in the extreme to match his senses, and were mostly taken from things he had liked the taste of as a boy. But if his senses were simple, they were at the same time extremely strong. To pause, therefore, and seek the reasons of things is out of the question. A melon, an emerald, a fox in the snow, so he raved, so he stared. When the boy, for alas, a boy it must be, no woman could skate with such speed and vigour, swept almost on tiptoe past him, Orlando was ready to tear his hair with vexation that the person was of his own sex, and thus all embraces were out of the question. But the skater came closer. Legs, hand, carriage were a boy's. But no boy ever had a mouth like that. No boy had those breasts. No boy had eyes which looked as if they had been fished from the bottom of the sea. Finally, coming to a stop and sweeping a curtsy with the utmost grace to the king, who was shuffling past on the arm of some lord in waiting, the unknown skater came to a standstill. She was not a hand's breadth off. She was a woman. Orlando stared, trembled, turned hot, turned cold, longed to hurl himself through the summer air, to crush acorns beneath his feet, to toss his arms with the beech trees and the oaks. As it was, he drew his lips up over his small white teeth, opened them perhaps half an inch as if to bite, shut them as if he had been bitten. The lady Euphrosyne hung upon his arm. The stranger's name, he found, was the Princess Marusha Stanislavska Dagmar Natasha Ilyana Romanovich, and she had come in the train of the Muscovite ambassador, who was her uncle perhaps, or perhaps her father, to attend the coronation. Very little was known of the Muscovites. In their great beards and furred hats they sat almost silent, drinking some black liquid which they spat out now and then upon the ice. None spoke English, and French, with which some at least were familiar, was then little spoken at the English court. It was through this accident that Orlando and the princess became acquainted. They were seated opposite each other at the great table spread under a huge awning for the entertainment of the notables. The princess was placed between two young lords, one Lord Francis Vere and the other the young Earl of Moray. It was laughable to see the predicament she soon had them in. For though both were fine lads in their way, the babe unborn had as much knowledge of the French tongue as they had. When at the beginning of the dinner the princess turned to the earl and said, with a grace which ravished his heart, "Je crois avoir fait la connaissance d'un gentilhomme qui vous était apparenté en Pologne l'été dernier, or la beauté des dames de la cour Angleterre me met dans le ravissement. On ne peut voir une dame plus gracieuse que votre reine, ni une coiffure plus belle que la sienne." Both Lord Francis and the Earl showed the highest embarrassment. The one helped her largely to horseradish sauce, the other whistled to his dog and made him beg for a marrow bone. At this the princess could no longer contain her laughter, and Orlando, catching her eyes across the boars' heads and stuffed peacocks, laughed too. He laughed, but the laugh on his lips froze in wonder. Whom had he loved? What had he loved? He asked himself in a tumult of emotion. Until now. An old woman, he answered, all skin and bone. Red-cheeked trolls, too many to mention. A puling nun, a hard-bitten, cruel-mouthed adventuress, a nodding mass of lace and ceremony. Love had meant to him nothing but sawdust and cinders. The joys he had had of it tasted insipid in the extreme. He marvelled how he could have gone through without yawning. For as he looked, the thickness of his blood melted, the ice turned to wine in his veins. He heard the waters flowing and the birds singing. Spring broke over the hard wintry landscape. His manhood woke. He grasped a sword in his hand. He charged a more daring foe than pole or moor. He dived in deep water. He saw the flower of danger growing in a crevice. He stretched his hand. In fact, he was rattling off one of his most impassioned sonnets when the princess addressed him. "Would you have the goodness to pass the salt?" He blushed deeply. "With all the pleasure in the world, madam," he replied, speaking French with a perfect accent. For, heaven be praised, he spoke the tongue as his own. His mother's maid had taught him, yet perhaps it would have been better for him had he never learnt that tongue, never answered that voice, never followed the light of those eyes. The princess continued. Who were those bumpkins, she asked him, who sat beside her with the manners of stablemen? What was the nauseating mixture they had poured on her plate? Did the dogs eat at the same table with the men in England? Was that figure of fun at the end of the table with her hair rigged up like a maypole, comme un grand perche mal fagoté, really the Queen? And did the King always slobber like that? And which of those popinjays was Georges Villiers? Though these questions rather discomposed Orlando at first, they were put with such archness and drollery that he could not help but laugh. And as he saw from the blank faces of company that nobody understood a word, he answered her as freely as she asked him, speaking as she did in perfect French. Thus began an intimacy between the two which soon became the scandal of the court. Thanks for listening, and we will continue the remainder of Chapter 1 of Orlando by Virginia Woolf tomorrow evening at the same time, 11 p.m. in the UK. Bye.